They threw a Chinese widow into an icy creek. A mountain man turned back when he heard, "Husband." The sound was wrong. It wasn't the crack of a falling branch, heavy with ice, nor the low growl of a predator hunkered down for the winter. It was a splash, thin and violent, followed by a man's coarse laugh that the cold air stole and shattered against the pines. Jebediah stopped, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle slung over his shoulder. He had been tracking a buck for 2 days, and the promise of fresh meat was a powerful lure, pulling him onward, away from the troubles of other men. He had made a life out of turning his back on those troubles. His cabin was a good 10 miles into the high country, a place where the only laws were the turn of the seasons and the hunger in a wolf's belly. He had not spoken to another soul in 5 months. He preferred it that way. He took another step, deliberately putting the sound behind him. It was none of his business. Down by the creek was where the lower trail ran, the one used by trappers and prospectors and other fools who thought the mountains would give up their secrets for the asking. Whatever was happening down there was a part of a world he had left behind. He listened for the buck, for the snap of a twig that would tell him his hunt was almost over. But another sound came, sharper this time. A woman's cry, choked with ice and fear. Jebediah's jaw tightened. He kept walking. A woman had no place this deep in the territory in the heart of winter, not alone. She was likely with the men who were laughing, a dispute among thieves or drunkards. Still not his business. The muscles in his massive shoulders bunched under his heavy coat of furs. His beard, thick and wild, was frosted with his own breath. He was a great bear of a man, built for this solitude, for the sheer force required to survive it. He had turned from the world of men because their cruelties were small and meaningless, and he had no patience for either. Then the word came. It was not a scream for help, not a plea for mercy. It was one word, flung into the frozen air like a last desperate stone. "Husband!" The word hit Jebediah with the force of a physical blow. It stopped him dead in his tracks, his snowshoes sinking deep into the powder. Husband. It was a word of belonging, of protection, of a bond he knew only from a life he'd buried long ago. It was a claim. And it was aimed at the empty forest, at the cold, indifferent sky, at him. He stood for a long moment, the silence of the snow-laden woods pressing in. He could still ignore it. He could finish his hunt, and by the time he returned to his cabin, the creek would be silent again, the snow covering whatever ugliness had transpired. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the thing that would keep him safe, keep him alone. Therefore, he turned back. He moved through the trees, not with the lumbering gait one might expect from a man his size, but with a hunter's deliberate silence. He came to the ridge overlooking the creek and peered through the dense branches of a spruce. Below, the scene was stark against the white snow. 3 men, rough and bearded, stood on the bank of the half-frozen creek. They were laughing as they watched a small figure struggle in the churning, icy water. It was a woman, her dark hair plastered to her face. She was impossibly small, swallowed by the current. What struck him most, a detail so absurd it seemed unreal, was the light pink of her dress. A thin prairie dress, the kind a woman might wear for a church social in July. Now a sodden, freezing shroud. Her feet were bare. Her tiny wooden cabin, not much bigger than a shed, was a ruin behind them. The door was kicked in, its contents strewn across the snow. A broken crate, scattered rice, a shredded blanket. They had taken what little she had and then decided to finish the job. One of the men, a lanky fellow with a greasy buckskin coat, picked up a rock. "She's a fighter, this one," he sneered. "Let's see how she fights this." Jebediah didn't think. He simply acted. He raised his rifle, the butt settling into the familiar hollow of his shoulder. He didn't aim for the man with the rock. He aimed for a thick icicle hanging from a branch just above his head. The rifle's report was a deafening crack that ripped through the quiet air. The icicle exploded, showering the man in a spray of sharp, frozen shards. He yelled, dropping the rock and clutching at his face. The other two spun around, their hands flying to the pistols at their belts, their eyes scanning the trees for the source of the shot. They saw nothing. Jebediah had already moved, melting back between the trees. He was a part of the forest, a phantom in the snow. He let out a low, guttural cry that was not quite human, the sound a cornered grizzly might make. It echoed off the canyon walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The men's bravado evaporated. They were trespassers here, and they knew it. The high country had its own dangers, and a lone rifle shot, coupled with that sound, spoke of a breed of man they had no desire to confront. They exchanged a panicked look, holstered their weapons, and scrambled for their horses tethered nearby. In moments they were gone, their hoofbeats muffled by the deep snow. Jebediah waited until the last sound of them had faded. He slid down the embankment, his long legs eating up the distance. The woman was barely clinging to a rock in the middle of the creek, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her eyes were closed, her face a pale bluish white. He waded into the water without hesitation. The cold was a living thing, a brutal shock that stole his breath and burned his skin even through his thick trousers and boots. He reached her in 3 strides. "I have you," he said, his voice a low rumble she likely didn't hear. He scooped her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of wet cloth and fragile bones. Her head lolled against his chest. She was Chinese, he realized, seeing her features up close. That explained the isolation, the tiny cabin. The railroad had brought hundreds of her people to the territory, but once the tracks were laid, they were often left to fend for themselves in a hostile land. He carried her out of the water and laid her on the snowbank, stripping off his heavy fur coat to wrap around her. Her skin was like ice. Her lips were blue. He knew he had only minutes. His cabin was miles away, all of it uphill. His horse was tethered a mile back, too far to retrieve. There was only one way. He lifted her again, cradling her against the warmth of his own body, and began the climb. He moved with a steady, relentless rhythm, his powerful legs pumping, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The woman in his arms did not stir. He felt a flicker of a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years, a cold, sharp dread. He had turned back for a stranger, for a word cried into the wind, and now he might only be carrying a dead woman home. He pushed the thought away and focused on the next step, and the one after that. The sun was beginning to dip below the peaks, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. The cold deepened. He could feel the woman's shivering lessen, a dangerous sign. He walked faster. His cabin was nestled in a hollow, protected from the worst of the winds by a stand of ancient pines. It was a solid structure of his own making, with thick log walls and a stone chimney that now trickled a thin line of smoke from the embers he'd banked that morning. He shouldered the door open and carried her inside. The single room was spare and functional. A rope bed in one corner, a sturdy table and chair, a stone hearth, and shelves lined with preserved food in jars. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and cured leather. He laid her on the thick bear pelt in front of the hearth and immediately set to work. He stirred the embers, adding kindling and then larger logs until a roaring fire filled the room with heat and flickering light. He gently unwrapped his coat from her and then, with a clinical detachment, began to remove the freezing, sodden pink dress. There was no modesty in it, only the grim necessity of survival. Her body was frail, bruised, and terrifyingly cold. He found a wool blanket, one of his few comforts, and wrapped her tightly, tucking it around her feet and under her chin. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on a hook over the fire. For the next hour, he worked to bring her back to life. He chafed her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation. He brewed a weak tea from willow bark, a frontier remedy for fever and pain. When she was conscious enough to swallow, he lifted her head and helped her drink, drop by drop. Color slowly began to return to her cheeks. The violent shivering returned, and this time he was relieved to see it. It meant her body was fighting. Finally, she opened her eyes. They were dark, almond-shaped, and filled with a profound exhaustion. They fixed on his face, on the wild beard and long tangled hair, and for a moment, fear flickered in their depths. "You are safe," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "They are gone." She watched him, her gaze unwavering. She didn't speak. He wasn't sure if she could, or if she even understood his words. He simply nodded, stood up, and went to the other side of the room, giving her space. He took off his own wet boots and trousers, hanging them near the fire to dry, and pulled on a dry pair of buckskins. He was acutely aware of her presence, a small, fragile thing in the heart of his solitary world. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the sound of another person's breathing. Later that night, as the wind howled outside, she stirred and pushed herself into a sitting position, the blanket clutched around her. Her eyes were clearer now. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was thin, raspy, but the words were clear. Jebediah was stirring a pot of venison stew over the fire. He looked over his shoulder. "Rest. You need to get your strength back." "My home," she said, her voice catching. "They destroyed everything." "I saw," he said simply. There was nothing else to say. He ladled some of the hot broth into a wooden bowl and brought it to her. "Eat this. It's not much, but it's hot." She took the bowl with trembling hands. "My name is Lynn." "Jebediah," he replied, and the name felt strange on his own tongue. No one had called him that in a decade. She ate the broth slowly, gratefully. When she was finished, she looked at him again, a question in her eyes. "Why did you help me?" Jebediah turned back to the fire, staring into the flames. He thought of the words she had cried, the claim she had made on him without knowing it. But he couldn't explain that. It felt too personal, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. "No one deserves to die in a frozen creek," he said at last. It was the truth, but not the whole truth. He slept on the floor that night, leaving her the bed. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the storm and the quiet rhythm of her breathing, and knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his life of perfect solitude was over. But as the fire died down to glowing embers, he also knew that the men who had attacked her were still out there. Therefore, the danger was not gone. It had simply followed him home. Over the next few days, a quiet routine settled in the small cabin. Lynn's strength returned slowly. She was reserved, speaking only when necessary, but her gratitude was evident in small actions. She mended a tear in one of his shirts with neat, precise stitches that were far better than his own clumsy work. She insisted on helping him prepare their simple meals, her movements economical and graceful in the cramped space. Jebediah was surprised by her resilience. She carried her loss with a quiet dignity that he found himself respecting more each day. He learned she had come to the territory with her husband to work a small gold claim he had bought with his railroad wages, only to have him die of a fever a year prior. She had stayed, trying to work the claim herself, because she had nowhere else to go. One afternoon, Jebediah was outside splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound in the snow-muffled forest. He felt a prickling on the back of his neck, the instinct of a man who has lived long enough in the wild to recognize when he is being watched. He stopped, his hand resting on the axe handle, and slowly scanned the dense line of trees at the edge of the clearing. He saw nothing but snow and shadow, but the feeling remained. They had come back, or at least one of them had, scouting. He said nothing to Lynn when he went back inside, not wanting to frighten her, but that night he cleaned his rifle with extra care and slept with it beside him on the floor. The peace of their sanctuary had been broken. The next morning he found tracks at the edge of the woods. A single horseman had been there, watching the cabin. He knew he had to act. "I'm going hunting," he told Lynn, shouldering his rifle and a small pack. "I'll be back by nightfall. Keep the door barred." She met his gaze, and he saw that she understood. There was fear in her eyes, but also a steady resolve. She simply nodded. "Be careful, Jebediah." He didn't go hunting. He circled wide, picking up the scout's trail and following it down the mountain. The tracks led to a crude, temporary camp a few miles away. There were 3 of them, the same 3 from the creek. He could hear their voices, including the whining complaint of the man he'd hit with the icicle. The leader, a burly man with a cruel set of eyes named Barlow, was speaking. "He's just one man," Barlow said, spitting a wad of tobacco into the snow, "and he's got a cabin full of supplies. We wait for the next snow, move in at night. He won't know what hit him. We'll take his furs, his food, and finish what we started with the woman." Jebediah slipped away as silently as he had come, his mind racing. He was one man, and they were 3. In a straight fight, the odds were not in his favor. But this was his mountain. He knew its secrets, its moods, its teeth. He would not fight them on their terms. He would fight them on his. When he returned to the cabin, the sun was low. Lynn had a pot of something simmering over the fire and had laid out 2 bowls on the table. She looked up as he entered, her relief palpable. "Did you find them?" she asked quietly. "I did," he said, setting his rifle down. "They plan to come back during the next storm." He watched her face, expecting to see terror. Instead, her chin lifted. "Then we will be ready for them," she said. Her courage surprised him. She was not a warrior, but she was not a victim either. In that moment, his desire to protect her sharpened into a fierce, unwavering commitment. They were in this together. That night, as the first flakes of the predicted snow began to fall, they sat by the fire, the cabin silent except for the crackling flames. "Lynn," Jebediah began, his voice low, "that day at the creek, the word you shouted." She looked down at her hands, which were clasped in her lap. "I know. It was a lie." "Why?" he asked. Not an accusation, but a genuine question. She was quiet for a long time. "My husband Way was a good man, a strong man, but he was gentle. When men from the mining camp would try to cheat him, he would not fight. He would just walk away. One day, a man followed him from the assay office, accused him of stealing, and beat him. No one helped. Way died 2 days later." She looked up, and her eyes held a deep, old pain. "I learned something that day. A man's property is more sacred in this land than a man's life. A plea for help is just noise. But a cry for a husband? That is a claim, an appeal to ownership. I hoped it might make someone listen. I did not know who was in the trees. I only knew I was about to die." He saw it then. It wasn't just a desperate cry. It was a calculated, last-ditch effort born of bitter experience, an act of profound intelligence in the face of brutal violence. He reached out, his large, calloused hand covering her small ones. It was the first time he had touched her outside of the rescue. "It worked," he said softly. "I listened." In her lap, her fingers curled around a small, smooth object that hung from a cord around her neck. She drew it out. It was a simple, flat piece of jade, worn smooth with time, a soft green against her skin. "This was his. It is all I have left of him." Jebediah looked at the small stone, a tangible piece of the life that had been stolen from her. He understood that she wasn't just fighting for her own survival. She was fighting to honor the memory of the man she had lost, refusing to let his gentleness be erased by the world's cruelty. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze before letting go. "Get some rest," he said, standing up. "The storm is here, and so are they." The snow fell thick and fast, a blinding white curtain that swallowed the world. As Jebediah had predicted, Barlow and his men used the cover of the storm to approach the cabin. They moved clumsily, thinking the blizzard was their ally. They were wrong. It was his. He had spent the afternoon preparing. He had rigged a deadfall trap using a massive log on the narrow path leading to the clearing. Inside the cabin, Lynn kept the fire burning low, making the cabin appear quiet, asleep. Jebediah was not in the cabin. He was outside, wrapped in a white blanket for camouflage, hidden in the hollow of a snowdrift he'd dug himself, 20 yards from his own front door. He waited, motionless, as the three figures emerged from the swirling snow. They approached the cabin in a clumsy crouch, Barlow in the lead. "See? Asleep," Barlow whispered, a cruel grin on his face. He gestured for one of his men to circle around the back. It was the lanky one from the creek. The man took 2 steps onto the narrow path. Jebediah pulled the rope he'd laid under the snow. There was a sharp crack, a whoosh of displaced air, and a sickening thud. The man screamed once, a sound instantly cut off. Barlow and the other man spun around in confusion, pistols drawn. What was that? From the cabin, a lantern suddenly flared to life in the window, casting a bright light across the clearing and momentarily blinding them. It was Lynn's signal. As their eyes adjusted, Jebediah rose from the snow like an avenging spirit, a giant figure of white and fury. He didn't fire his rifle. He charged. He hit Barlow with the force of a battering ram, sending the larger man sprawling into a deep snowdrift. The third man, panicked, fired his pistol wildly, the shot going high and wide. Before he could fire again, Jebediah's fist connected with his jaw, and the man dropped like a sack of grain. Barlow was struggling to get out of the snowdrift, sputtering curses. Jebediah hauled him up by the front of his coat, his face inches from Barlow's. "This is my mountain," Jebediah snarled, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "You are not welcome here." He didn't kill him. He bound Barlow and the unconscious man with rope, leaving them in the snow. The lanky man in the trap was dead. In the morning, when the storm had passed, Jebediah loaded the 2 living men onto a makeshift sled. He would drag them 20 miles to the nearest freight station and hand them over to be taken to the territorial marshal. As he prepared to leave, Lynn came out of the cabin. She handed him a bundle of bread and dried meat. Their eyes met. No words were needed. An understanding had been forged between them in the fire of shared crisis. He had saved her life, and she, in turn, had saved his. She had brought him back from a self-imposed exile, reminding him that some things were worth fighting for. By the following spring, the world had changed. The harsh white of winter had given way to the vibrant green of new life. Where Lynn's ruined shack had once stood, a new, far sturdier cabin was now built. Its logs were expertly notched, its stone chimney solid and true. Jebediah had built the frame, but Lynn had worked alongside him, chinking the logs with a mixture of mud and moss, her small hands surprisingly strong. A tilled garden patch, protected by a wattle fence, was already showing the first green shoots of beans and squash. One afternoon, a circuit judge, making his yearly rounds, stopped at their homestead. He was a stern-faced man, but he listened patiently as Jebediah explained their situation. He looked from the massive mountain man to the quiet, dignified Chinese woman. He saw the new cabin, the tilled earth, the way they stood together, not touching, but occupying the same space with a sense of shared purpose. He grunted, pulled out a stack of papers from his saddlebag, and helped them file a joint claim on the 160 acres under the Homestead Act. When he left, a legal deed with both their names on it was tucked safely inside the cabin. Barlow and his man had been tried and sent to the territorial prison. The story, carried by freighters and trappers, had spread through the territory. It had become a small legend. The story of the mountain man who had come down from his peak to protect a Chinese widow. They were no longer seen as an oddity, but as people who belonged to the land they worked. That evening, Jebediah was down by the creek, the same one where he had first seen her. The water ran clear and fast now, washing away the last of the winter ice. He looked up at their homestead on the rise, a permanent, solid thing against the backdrop of the mountains. Lynn was in the garden, weeding. She straightened up, saw him watching, and raised a hand. "Jebediah!" she called out, and her voice carried easily on the warm air. The name no longer felt strange. It felt like his. He raised a hand in return. He thought of the first time he had heard her voice, a desperate cry for a husband who was gone. Now she called his name, a simple word that held the promise of a shared future, of a home built by two pairs of hands. A man can build walls around his life as high as the mountains themselves, but he was learning that the strongest shelters are not the ones you build for yourself alone. They are the ones you build for someone else.